My name is Dominique Samda. I'm a research fellow at UMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. This is an Ataya seminar. The Ataya seminar is a research seminar at UMA, and it's curated and normally hosted by my colleague, Ralph Borland, that couldn't be with us today. So I'm exceptionally replacing him today and welcoming Dr. Bhorat, whose work is absolutely fascinating and I think important for UMA, and especially for all the UMA researchers that are working on AI and the ethics of AI. And for me in particular, because I'm not only working on AI and the ethics of AI, but also on slavery. So you can imagine how excited I am to hear your work today. So let me introduce you to Dr. Bhorat. Ziyaad Bhorat is a South African political theorist of technology, and he's currently a postdoctoral fellow with the University of Southern California, and also at Harvard Kennedy School. His interdisciplinary work examines automation as transformational development in human history, first, and also a precondition for advanced technologies like AI. His research projects explore the classical foundation and policy implications of challenge to democracy, like digital authoritarianism. Sorry, my French tongue is very reluctant to pronounce it, but you understood me. And also the emergence of political right to freedom from automated technologies. And I think that's particularly useful for us to think through that. He's been recently awarded from a PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles. In 2022, I had the chance to look a little bit at the dissertation. It's quite fascinating as well. And he also received a master's degree from there. He has been a visiting scholar at CNRS, the Center for Scientific Research, and he has been lecturing on technology and politics for Equitech Futures. And yes, he has worked also for companies or consulting for companies like Walt Disney. So I hope that we are going to have a very rich conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Bhorat, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really happy, obviously, to be here, phoning in from Los Angeles. It's great to be with the HUMA team, who I thank profusely for extending this invitation, and also to be a part of the Ataya series. I'm going to share my screen as I have a presentation that will accompany my talk, and hopefully everyone will be able to see that. But essentially today, I'd like to talk a little bit about a new conception that I've been working on, which is digital despotism, in the context of some of the theories that I work on, particularly theories of slavery, and how work and life in relation to technology has sort of been challenged by the post-colonial condition, or perturbed is the word that I like to use because it's such a wonderful word that means a disturbance. And so that's really what I'd like to get today, and hopefully with your input after this talk and throughout, we can really meditate on what technology and digital technologies have meant for us as people from the global South, or as people from a different condition in this age relative to previous ages. So this actually, there are two framing images that I thought interesting to share to start off with. The first is really to do with the ancient idea of an ambiguity when it comes to slavery, work, and technology. This first image is a terracotta model from Thebes, Boeotia, which is in central Greece, and was a kind of, relative to Athens and Sparta, probably a little less notable, but it was in central Greece. And what we see here is a model of women working to make bread, and a kind of supervisory figure standing next to them with a flute in his hand, actually, and this is one of the interpretations, actually giving rhythm to the process of bread making. And in this, we can see a kind of relationship of technology to the process of work and production and human life, which is so interesting for us. The idea that the flute, in the Greek sense, a flute was part of the musical arts, and arts in general were crafted from the Greek word techne. Techne is the word from which we actually get our word, technology. So it's fascinating to see even then this meditation on how the rhythms of technology play a role in work and our human lives. And actually, if you look at how this particular terracotta model is categorized at the Louvre and in various interpretations, people assume that this is slave work, right? This is why I put the kind of question of slavery. It's ambiguity here, but it is this idea that actually these women who are making this bread are under the rhythm of technology or are actually in a condition of slavery. It's not confirmed, but it is one of the more popular interpretations. Juxtapose it next to the next image, which is on a Foxconn assembly line, where we largely see women also working in what has sometimes been called sweatshop conditions. So there have been a number of labor complaints and controversies with Foxconn. And as we know, it's one of the largest suppliers of Apple's technology and infrastructure. It's a Taiwanese company. And you can see even a figure of a supervisory figure behind the workers. And it's just striking to juxtapose these two images together, because they really talk to techne in the Greek, this arts and craft or the technology itself, setting the pace of human work and of life. And also the ambiguity of what slavery means for us today in relation to the work that appears before us. And what's interesting about this as well is that this idea that technology shapes our rhythms and our lives is something that Marxist scholars have already noticed. Marx himself, Karl Marx, in his in Das Kapital in chapter 15, which is on machinery, talks about how the advent of the modern factory causes our rhythms, the workers' rhythms, to actually adjust to capital or adjust to the automated factory or industrialized factory itself. So this is an insight that Marxist scholars themselves have noticed, and most notably and relevant for us, applied to the digital world. So Christian Fuchs is a sociologist who's written on capitalism, patriarchy, and slavery in the age of digital capitalism and digital labor. He's also written a book on digital labor and Karl Marx. And what he said is that all labor and class relations have a certain dimension of slavery. He's looked at the entire pipeline of work as it comes to, for example, my laptop sitting in front of me and the very minerals that are mined in, say, Eastern Congo, and said that the ICT supply chain is one that often rests on slave work itself and therefore can be called digital slavery. Jack Lynch on Q has actually taken this even further. He said that the free labor involved in user-generated content is a form of manufactured slavery. So not just only on the production side, i.e. workers working on, the ICT supply chain, but actually ourselves as participants in social media platforms, for example, generating content, according to Jack Lynch on Q. Being addicted to this, which was a big part of slavery narratives and what slavery actually meant, is a form of a kind of slavery. So these scholars want to bring in the idea of slavery into the digital context to say that digital technologies themselves are shaping our relationship to work and life, and not always for the best. In fact, for them, it's turning to a form of slavery. Now, there's an interesting perturbation or disturbance in this idea as well, if we look at post-colonial scholars and decolonial scholars as well. Akile Mbembe is probably one of the most influential political theorists, and in the critique of Black reason, he notes that there's these critical moments in what he says are the biography of the vertiginous assembly that is Blackness as race. The first moment was the despoliation of the Atlantic slave trade. The second is in the kind of 18th century when writing became accessible to people of African descent. And slave rights began the process of colonialism and of resisting colonialism. The Haitian revolts all began, and the third moment itself inaugurates electronic and digital technologies. So for Mbembe, what he says is that men and women in this first moment from Africa were transformed into human objects, human commodities, and human money. And this maps on, quite interestingly, what he says in the third moment, that in this new moment of digital, in the electronic, that we become a human thing, a human machine, a human code, a human in flux. This is an interesting way to think about the mapping on of slavery in post-colonial discourse into the new digital condition. And in fact, this has been taken up by post-colonial scholars most acutely in the South African context, actually. Tshilidzi Marwala has talked about how the fourth industrial revolution and AI will introduce new forms of slavery. Artwell Nemachena and Munyaradzi Mawere have said post-colonial Africans are still wearing their now invisible slave badges, slave collars, slave chains, and slave cuffs in the 21st century. And these are both meditations on geopolitical relations, i.e. the fact that Africans as a whole, South Africans, largely do not own their data infrastructure, do not own their data, right? And are subject to, the global hegemony of various forces in the data space, in our increasingly technologized life. And therefore become a kind of commodity to be disintegrated and to be owned, controlled, and exploited in a new sense in the digital condition, in this post-colonial digital condition. And I will add at this point that I think that Artwell and Munyaradzi's book title, Securitizing Monstrous Bottoms in the Age of the Post-Human Carnivalesque, is probably one of my favorite of titles. And actually the gist of that book, I recommend it quite a lot, is actually very interesting in resisting the kind of ontological moves, or the moves in understanding what it means to be, that we find in contemporary philosophical discourse in the West. They're not alone, obviously. So Evaristo Banheira has also written on this, the fourth industrial revolution and the recolonizing of Africa. And he said, digital slavery is also known as data slavery. It will lead to the recolonization of Africa. He calls this the sum of all colonialities. And I love the way that he has put this as so well. A sum of all colonialities, aka a summa colonialities. And this actually comes directly from the Summa Theologica, which for some of you who are not aware, was a very famous medieval Christian text by Thomas Aquinas, who is an Aristotelian scholar and very important figure in the Catholic Church. But this whole idea that digital will usher in a whole-scale change in our society, that it can usher in a recolonization of Africa, that it can be termed digital slavery, becomes a very important way in which Global South and South Africa in particular, and African and post-colonial scholars are thinking about how technology is starting to affect us, right? And it's very often, it's very different from the way that I've seen it in Western discourse, for example, the kind of techno-optimistic strand of thinking that technology is going to liberate us. No, in fact, what these scholars are saying from their own experience, from the experience of post-coloniality, from Blackness, from exploitation, is that this might lead us down a path into slavery itself. But now I want to just throw some complications on the water, because slavery might not be the right term that we want to use here, right? And I want to challenge this a little bit by reading a narrative from Harriet Jacobs, who is a former slave in the antebellum South in the United States in the 19th century. And I'm going to read this passage because it's very visceral. It explains the violence of slavery itself. I was never cruelly overworked. I was never lacerated with the whip from head to foot. I was never so beaten and bruised that I could not turn from one side to the other. I never had my heel strings cut to prevent my running away. I was never chained to a log and forced to drag it about while I toiled in the fields from morning till night. I was never branded with a hot iron or torn by bloodhounds. On the contrary, I had always been kindly treated and tenderly cared for until I came into the hands of Dr. Flint. I had never wished for freedom till then, but though my life in slavery was comparatively devoid of hardships, God pity the woman who is compelled to lead such a life. And for those who don't know, Harriet Jacobs also experienced sexual violence and sexual assault when she came into the house of Dr. Flint. But here, she talks about the material violence of slavery, which at that point she mentions she had not particularly experienced on the same level as other slaves as well, but that there was actual violence, whipping, the body being a locus point for the destruction that goes on in slavery. It's an interesting passage because it also explores how not all slaves suffered in the same way. There's not just one type of slave. There's various forms of slavery, sexual harassment under this larger umbrella of domination. Slavery as an idea captures both this material violence, I think. And that's why I want to say that maybe this metaphor of digital slavery fails to adequately ground the material violences that we sometimes see in actual slavery itself, the enforcement on the body, having heel strings cut, being whipped, etc. So that the metaphor for slavery that we see in some post-colonial discourse recognizes some of that generational experience of exploitation and therefore must be listened to. And therefore this appeal is legitimate. But perhaps there's a different register on which we can operate when thinking about the role of digital slavery or digital technologies. And so I want to offer an alternative, which is very much related, the idea of despotism. Despotism actually comes from the Greek word despotes, which means a master, a ruler, an owner. In the Greek, it was the despotes and the doulos. The doulos was one word and a major word for the slave. And perhaps we can say that slavery itself, we know, is a despotic relationship between master and slave. But not all despotism involves slavery, because as we've seen, the kinds of slavery that Harriet Jacobs refers to involve a kind of material violence, actual bodily violence, conditions in which the body and people are whipped, are harassed, are coerced in ways that perhaps digital technologies do not fully capture. This idea of despotism actually is already in work in sociological discourse. So Alessandro Delfanti writes a piece about machinic dispossession and augmented despotism, digital work in an Amazon warehouse, that explores how digital capitalism relies on an augmented form of despotism and machinic dispossession to control labor, that these Amazon algorithms themselves, because of their nature, substituting for our decision-making in warehouses, actually form a kind of despotic relation. More acutely, an idea of digital despotism has already emerged. And this is precisely where I want to enter into the picture, this idea of digital despotism, which is currently theorized by Sabine Pfeiffer, who is another sociologist, as an economic regime. And so Sabine takes this idea from Michael Burraway, who was also a sociologist, and his idea of hegemonic despotism, and applies it to a largely aggregate economic regime, right? Along these various forms of axes to do with economic exploitation, such that digital despotism is the digitally augmented hollowing out, not only of privacy, but of labor rights and the democratic potential of industrial relations. Pfeiffer argues that the digital kind combines bureaucratic control, computers, with physical control, machinery and assembly lines, and bodily control, wearables like data, glasses, and smart textiles to control and track individual behavior. It emerges from the fourth industrial revolution, but it's a global economic regime of brutal control, silent submission, industrial deregulation, and individual atomization. What's interesting about this table, hegemonic despotism and this idea of digital despotism itself, is it's an aggregate formulation. It's largely confined to the economic regime, which is extremely important and a part that we cannot ignore. In fact, is, I would argue, one of the major parts of this relationship to digital technologies. But I feel like we can disaggregate this further. And this is where I think theories of slavery themselves can play a role in grounding and giving a kind of framework to understand what is really happening in digital despotism, or in this idea of digital technologies applied in despotic relationships to our lives. And grounding this in a way that we can say, this is why we care. This is why we should care. These are the factors we should think about when thinking about the relationship, our relationship to digital technologies and tools. So digital despotism put in a kind of conversation, then experimental conversation, with one of the most notorious theoretical constructs of slavery is Aristotle, the Greek philosopher's theory of natural slavery. And so this is a very intimidating kind of table that I've presented here, but I will go over each part of it in detail. But I like to think of this by looking at Aristotle's theory. Aristotle theorized essentially that some people are born to rule and some people are born to be ruled. That is a very kind of bastardized summation of his idea of natural slavery, right? And the people who are born to be ruled, to work, to use their bodies, are impaired in certain ways. It is one of the most abject categories of human exclusion that I found in literature. The idea that someone is so deficient in their humanity that they are simply born to be ruled by others. And he signposts various ways in which they have been dispossessed essentially of their humanity. And I think what's interesting and for our purposes is to appropriate that, to take the lowest depths of radical exclusion in a theory and say, how can we signpost this as something that has traditionally been used as a weapon against peoples? For example, Aristotle's theory becomes one of the dominant theories in Spanish conquerors and colonialist discourses on American Indians to justify their subjugation. Also in the antebellum South, among the kind of thinkers and Christian thinkers in their exploitation of slaves and justifications for slavery there. Now, how can we appropriate, turn it on its head to become an actual warning for us to say, well, we are not this. We can signpost some of these elements to ensure that we, in our relationship to technology, remain autonomous. So I see it as a kind of a way to take the ideas that we've just been exploring in postcolonial discourse, in Marxist discourse, in the sociological discourse on digital despotism, and to frame it in a way that tells us, why do we care? What are the risk factors for digital that we ought to pay attention to that might have an impact on our autonomy, and that we can therefore identify in a single framework? And this is why I call it a syndrome of human dispossession. Syndrome in the Greek actually means syndrome, a running together of things, of human dispossession. And it's a dispossession on ontological and cognitive dimensions, which we'll get into right now. So ontological dispossession really refers to a sense of being and identity, that we are dehumanized, that who we are essentially is stripped away from us, what we are as humans. And so Aristotle's category, this natural slave, this abject category of exclusion, faces a number of ontological dispossessions. They face a loss of ownership. They are actually property themselves, these slaves. Ketema e anthropos on. They are there for the use of their body. Chresus to somatus. They are part of their owner. They are actually a part, considered an organ of their owner. Meros ti to despotu. So you can see just how dehumanizing this category is. And I've kind of put this in a conversation with what are the parallels then in the digital world? What does a loss of ownership translate to? Well, our position is users only in this world. What is use of the body, i.e. that slaves were only good for one particular lower skilled task? What does that translate into? Skills equality. What does a part of the owner mean? It means that you have no privacy. And going into each of these individually, a loss of ownership, tema e anthropos, user only, in the digital world is something that scholars are paying attention to. And this means a couple of things. On the economic side, we've seen that ownership is taking on a new structure in the digital world, right? Joshua Fairfield has written about how there's a death of property as we traditionally understand it. There's an exclusion from ownership in the digital world that might not be de jure, but it is certainly becoming de facto. You've seen, for example, kind of Twitter overlord Elon Musk in a very ironic statement saying Twitter's current lords and peasants system for who have or who doesn't have a blue mark check mark is bullshit. Power to the people, blue for $8 a month. But this lords and peasants system also speaks in a very ironic sense to the idea that economic power is now distributed in a way that for some appropriates a kind of despotic relationship, simply in economic terms, but also on technological terms. Digital tools are very different from a hand tool. If we look at this ancient Greek vase of a blacksmith store, you see people using hammers and tongs, etc., and perhaps they own these tools. But if we look next to that Bladen Jola's kind of schematic of, and I like this screw in the middle, schematic of the digital infrastructure and architecture. To own a piece of that infrastructure is much more difficult. To own your digital tools is just simply not a thing that we really have anymore. Users are now reliant in this technological matrix of energy, of hardware, network infrastructure, software, applications, and content proprietors to be able to exercise any residual form of ownership that might be left to us. And these are because of the nature of the stack of technology. Simply put, we are more likely to own our hand tools than we are to own our digital tools. So we become users only. This is one form of ontological disposition. Use itself speaks to what has been popularized as the digital divide, i.e., for Aristotle, slaves had a certain form of task, right? They were involved in menial labor, use of the body in particular, and if you wanted to avoid being slavish or a slave, you had a certain educational regime that you ought to have followed to become a master or to become a philosopher or to become someone engaged in politics. The split between high and low skilled is very acute. The digital divide is the digital parallel to this that Jan van Dijk has written about. And on one side, really, we're starting to see this. We're starting to see certain groups, small groups of engineers, software developers, having an inordinate amount of power and strategic interaction in the digital world that most people do not have. There's a vast inequality that we see, that a digital divide, for example, the World Economic Forum has said that it was exposed in the pandemic. 60% of adults lack digital skills required to work, learn, and access critical services online. This is very different to your digital engineer, your software developers, etc., and becomes an acute problem, this kind of splitting out of those who have the power to make use of the digital world and engage with it strategically, and those who do not. Privacy, as I said, it's difficult to conceptualize a form of dispossession of yourself and being so acute that you are considered a part of the person who owns you. This is the condition of the natural slave in Aristotle's philosophy, in Aristotle's theory. You are literally an organ of this person. And this is something that we're starting to see increasingly in the digital world as well. A loss of privacy, the proliferation of privacy rights and concerns about privacy. The idea that we are being essentially watched in a kind of panoptic system by social media companies, that data points or parts of our digital selves, like location, health preferences, relationships, which tell real information about our offline lives, can subordinate us in the digital world and flow, therefore, offline to our offline existences. Bernard Stiegler is a French philosopher who has suggested that automated social control has the tendency of disaggregating and disintegrating us so that the I in the individual is lost, leaving us as mere individuals, which I thought is a very kind of clever way to really drive home this dispossession of the self or the private self of the human individual. A loss of ownership in the digital world can therefore be accompanied by a dispossession of human independence and privacy. So that's what I mean when I say that we can actually appropriate from Aristotle's theory risk warnings of ontological dispossession that we can carry over into the digital world in a more systematic way. When it comes to cognitive dispossession, this has to do with what we know and how we know it and how we can, how we think. So Aristotle's slaves also were cognitively impaired. They were impaired in their ability to make decisions. They had a loss of their deliberative faculty. They were imbalanced in their force of character, psychologically imbalanced. They were either too full of spiritedness, plerethuma, or they were completely dispirited and kind of passive, aithuma. And this maps on to some of the things that we're seeing with the advent of AI, algorithms, predictive technologies, persuasive technologies, and choice algorithms that bypass or hinder our ability to make decisions, or platforms, social media platforms, and ongoing technological conditions that either bring out our aggression or passivity. This is what cognitive dispossession means, a kind of a becoming like someone who has been dispossessed of their decision-making capacity and their psychological control. So in decision-making, we do engage in various forms of outsourcing of decision-making to technology on a daily basis. Perhaps the most accepted form is in traffic, when to go, when to stop. One of my most hated things, and I'm sure some people might agree with me, is also in the way that we structure our airports. Our airports are designed for command and control. No matter what we think about the shiny and wonderful stores that they might have after you check in, after immigration, etc., it's still a space with a choice architecture that is designed to herd us into a certain way and to minimize kind of friction in a command and control model. But an Amazon warehouse, where your performance is tracked, your decision-making is completely taken over by algorithms that tell you exceptionally what to do, right? While we might have these kind of experiential opportunities over which to nominally exercise decision-making, the interactive sum total of proprietary systems, security protocol, and predictive and persuasive algorithms profoundly limit both the choices we can make and our independence in doing so. To frame this problem more acutely as well, it's not so much that the issue that we might yield our decision-making to algorithms that allow us to simplify our choices when deciding what to watch on, say, Netflix. It's also rather a failure to recognize that it's the same operative digital world and deliberative decision-making capacity at risk which we also employ when making political and moral decisions. And so we can reach this point in which decision-making, which is a bulwark against our ability to be dispossessed, what is needed to make moral and political decisions, becomes something at risk. Similarly, in psychological dispossession, what occurs is that either we're inflamed by the digital world or we find ourselves completely tuned out. It's kind of like a seesaw effect. And some scholars have been working on precisely this. Digital lethargy is an idea from Tung Hoi who talks about this idea that we're constantly on, constantly connected, especially if we're working, say, in an Amazon factory, that the digital world kind of wears us down. And he actually uses this word itself, that we find ourselves so worn down that we reach the state of digital lethargy, that we avoid decision-making, that we lose our kind of force of character. We become kind of it's a kind of selectivized passivity. But on the other hand, and which we're actually more familiar with, we can be full of aggression, full of hatred, polarization, right, in our social media engagements. And we've seen many studies about this as well. Bharath Ganesh talks about white thumos, the flows of rage in online audiences and alt-right, and actually uses the Greek word thumos that is involved in Aristotle's theory here. This idea that we are full of spirited characterness, we're psychologically imbalanced. And so this kind of balancing act, which is a hallmark of Aristotelian theory, really, when it comes to thinking about our moral and political lives, can be an either or. It can be our ability to make this balancing act in our psychological disposition becomes at risk through the digital world. So to review this kind of intimidating table, digital despotism is a way of structuring risk factors to say, okay, what's happening in the digital world? What's at risk? Can we see parallels, and how can we address this together, right? Becoming ontologically dispossessed means we're users only, that there's skills inequality, we're losing our privacy. Becoming cognitively dispossessed means that we're losing our ability to make decisions, that our psychological force of character is kind of imbalanced by the new technologies. And what that leads to in Aristotelian theory is a vulnerability of people to bad actors, to authoritarian control, despotic regimes. And so it feeds in quite nicely into some of the challenges that we're seeing today, right? On the micro level, using this framework, we can see the kind of risk factors that might be present in any given society that is subject to digital technologies in various forms and their relations. And on a macro level, we can tie it into trends that we are seeing already, right? That there is a marked decrease in democracy globally, according to a number of indices, the Democracy Index, VDEM Institute, etc., despite the fact that digital technology has been at its highest form of development and most accelerated form in the history of mankind. Digital despotism, therefore, sits in the middle of these two. So digital despotism, I want to say, results in this kind of modern, digitally enabled vulnerability to tyrannical or authoritarian control, which is a different way of thinking about, say, for example, these ideas of digital authoritarianism that have been leveled against China and Russia, etc., which assume, firstly, that these regimes, authoritarian regimes from the top down, actually take digital tools and use them against people. Instead, of a more cohesive way to think about this is that states, whether they're authoritarian already or not, and political actors across the board can exploit a common set of risk factors that we've just seen to generate more or less tyrannical authoritarian outcomes. So it's a broader conception than what we've seen in this kind of discourse. And then finally, it also gives us a way to think about how we multi-pronged targeted resistance, or categorize resistance and resilience. To counter our loss of ownership, our transformation into simply digital users in the digital world, we can see that various forms of privacy, the kind of modern equivalent to slaves stealing or seizing their master's property, or the development of free and open source tools becomes a potent check. To the skills inequality in digital, we can counter self and community-led reskilling. And there are a number of initiatives that have done just that, to bring and localize knowledge and to reskill communities upwards to be able to be active members in the digital world instead of passive. To privacy concerns, the proliferation of data protection on the aggregate side, but also users becoming anonymous or pseudonymous The ideas of these resistances on the individual and collective level can be targeted against this particular dispossession. To our ability, to losing some of our ability or impairment of our ability to make decisions, we can counter with hacktivism and hacking. And there are a number of examples where hacking groups have actually changed political outcomes, or groups of repair have gone into actual code and you know, counted various biases, whether it's of gender or race, to kind of make the algorithms that affect us on a daily basis more inclusive, slight incremental repair effectively. And to an imbalanced force of character, the seesawing act that we have to kind of always do, we can take digital detoxes, or digital minimalism has become a kind of code word in some scholarly discourse. Or on the other hand, social media activism that we saw, for example, with the Arab Spring. Although that didn't necessarily lead to democratization, the very fact that these kind of interventions are open, or forms of resilience and resistance are open to people, serve as potent checks against formation of digital despotism and macro-political digital authoritarianism. And so in all, this gives us a political theoretical framework, I think, that kind of that respects the balance and experiences of scholars who are looking at the language of slavery to assess our relationship to digital technology, right? While stressing that that there's a material violence that might be lacking that we found in earlier forms and many forms of slavery itself. Digital despotism, therefore, can also be linked to this framework, appropriated and repurposed to categorize all the forms of autonomy loss that we might experience in the digital world, and therefore all the ways in which we can form individual and collective resistances. So in conclusion, and I like to end off with this quote that I think is so poignant from Giorgio Agamben, who's a philosopher and political philosopher as well, is that slavery is still something, it's extraordinarily complex. It is to ancient humanity what modern technology is to modern humanity. Both as bare life watch over the threshold that allows access to the truly human condition. And so ending off then again, where we started with the terracotta models in kind of juxtaposition with the Foxconn assembly line, seeing a kind of repetition of our technological lives and work lives next to each other. I offer this idea of digital despotism as a point to start a conversation to think about our relation then, not just in work, but in our life as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ziyaad. Yeah, thank you so much. And I didn't want to interrupt you, even if you were slightly longer, but it was such an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. And I have no doubt that it's like plenty of questions and like a lot to comment, especially like on your like proposition of that syndrome of human dispossession. Because as you know, I told you before, somebody who was been so interested in the legacy of slavery in Africa and also in AI. I'm going to start by asking a question that maybe some other people in the audience wouldn't ask. But so I'm very interested in your analysis of the language of slavery and the use of the metaphor in your the construction of it, and also like very fascinated by how you work on and you choose to center your work and your conceptual work around Aristotle. That has been such a contested figure, and like of course how he's like thinking through like natural slavery. And so my question, and I have like some guess about why, but so I'm very critical in general in how we use the metaphor of slavery to think about like plenty and all of forms of contemporary exploitation, and I appreciate your kind of care and caution. However, like it seems that also it's like your reluctance feels very like US centered or like American centric. as somebody who looks at the reality of slavery on the African continent or in the Indian Ocean, like there's a lot of forms of slavery beyond plantation slavery, and the abjection and horror of slavery and the indignity of it are not all related to the kind of torture that you're describing. Like it doesn't take that for slavery to be abject. So I was wondering, like, what was your choice? Why did you make this choice of centering like the kind of reality of slavery around a specific form of slavery, that's what plantation slavery in mainly in the in North and Southern America and the Caribbean, and also certain like plantation islands. So yeah, that would be my first question, and I have plenty of others, but I'm going to be very mindful that plenty of other people might want to ask questions.
Sure, you're absolutely right, and I think there's a big kind of reflection in slavery discourse, which I'm sure you're aware of yourself, on thinking through what slavery means in different contexts. So someone like Paulin Ismard, who has written on kind of comparativism in slavery and the kind of edited work that he's brought together with a bunch of scholars, the book Les Mondes d'Esclavage, actually it looks at the ways in which we can maybe make or maybe not make comparisons in the context of slavery. For me, I think what is interesting, obviously I can't ignore the fact that I'm looking at it from the various educational backgrounds that have formed me, but also the interest areas that have pointed me based on my personal experiences. But why I pointed out Harriet Jacobs and why I point out Aristotle is that these seem to be extremities to me, right? Aristotle's theory is so thoroughly dehumanizing. I mean, he still considers slaves humans, but they're in this kind of gray zone, and they've really just been identified as people who are barely people. For me, that's an extremity worth exploring. And similarly, the kind of material violence that you find in Southern plantation, antebellum slavery, again, extreme forms of violence. But you're right, I want to be, because slavery is extraordinarily complex. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I chose perturbation, is that, in a mathematical sense, perturbation theory is a way of approximating very complex functions into a simplified form. So there is a bit of a kind of a simplification of very complex dynamics here, but the hope is that it's an ongoing simplification, perturbation, that we can get to a more clarified understanding of things. I just choose, for example, the extremities because I see them as these limit cases, in thinking through this and on one level.
Thank you so much for I appreciate your response, and I want to invite everybody that wants to ask a question to do so. We have a few minutes, so it's just going to take some some pressure, because you can't wait 15 minutes. It's going to be too late. So if you want to ask a question, and I see that my colleague Wangu Kimari has a hand raised. So everybody else, you can ask question, and you can also type your question in the chat if you don't want to unmute. Wangu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Ziyaad, for really a fascinating talk. My question, if I'm not extrapolating so much, builds off what Dom was asking. And so I'm curious, because slavery and enslavement implies really long histories of racialization. And I wonder if those were not so evident in your, obviously you're not using slavery, but in the despotism, are these, in your conception, are these racializations carried over in the digital despotism?
It's interesting. Yes, that's one thing that I didn't go into in as much detail, is that actually when you look at slavery in the Greek context, it very much was perhaps racialized, but definitely ethnicized, right? Slavery in Athens, which is where I'm most familiar, was slavery of foreign peoples that were conquered. Some of them were Greek, but a large majority were kind of Thracian, etc., different ethnicities. And Aristotle himself actually goes out of his way to say when certain groups of people are more prone to becoming slaves or natural slaves than others. Europeans and Asians, for example. He makes very ethnicist, proto-racial claims. And that is something that I think I've worked into my larger paper on this. I didn't necessarily bring it out in this because it has its own complicated history. But I think you're completely right. There's always a kind of racialized element into this that is extremely important. And that's why I hope to bring in the kind of I think experience-based points of view of African scholars that actually you don't really see much of in some of the Western discourses that I work with, especially as relates to the classics, when it comes to the notion of slavery. Even in some of the work that by sociologists I mentioned, by Christian Fuchs, by Alessandro Del Fanti, there's an element of racialization that is an ethnicization that I think is missing from this. So you're absolutely spot on to point on this, because this is something that plays a role very much so in the global digital political economy, in the hegemony of various forms of actors, whether they be platforms in the West or data centers in the East, or that are scrambling for Africa, but at the same time introducing new forms of dominance. And I think this is something Akili Mbembe is more acutely, he brings out to the fore in his discussion on the critique of Black reason.
Thank you so much. And okay, I would want to discuss that forever, but we can't. But also I'm going to let the floor. I need to be generous, but I have so many questions. But I am very interested in what you just said, because okay, if we have some minutes after, I would want to ask you why as a political thinker and philosopher, or why the choice of Aristotle, and why this the conversation around what is in what is the colonial library, what we do with it, what a recent PhD scholar recently awarded with the diploma. Why Aristotle? And I'm really fascinated because also I think you were mentioning that you were interested in discussing what it meant to be thinking from the global south. So, but I'm going to leave you with that question that we can maybe discuss later. And we have hand that is raised here. Hello, I think you are unmuted.
Hi, yeah, I'm unmuted, I think. My name's Nick from Cape Town, not Natalie. I'm borrowing a laptop. Hi, Ziyaad. I've got almost a twofold question. I don't know if it's early or appropriate enough to talk about what liberation from this kind of despotism or slavery would look like, given the fact that slavery in ancient Greece, slavery in America, they changed or they developed to sort of not exist anymore. But then part and parcel of that is, have we ever lived in a time as humans where we have not had slavery as a structure or as a superstructure?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think, again, there's a lot of haranguing about what slavery means and how it can be defined in discourses today, but also in practical definitions of it. And as a result, there are various claims on how slavery presents itself in the world today. By some measures, we have at this point in time more slaves in the world than we've ever had in history, right? So I think you're correct to note that there's this enduring legacy of slavery, that these ideas of slavery carry on. And in fact, I've sometimes been charged and told that maybe we need to shelve the use of slavery as a metaphor, or even slavery in discourse, because maybe that'll make it go away. But it doesn't. It doesn't go away. I think what's important to and what I've tried to do by using this framework is to identify the kind of points where you can both categorize forms of collective or individual resistance, but then also offer it when it comes to digital technologies. So for example, when you hear of local communities, and I think there was an entire series with Saname the last time I was present, who talks about and the ways in which African communities can take ownership of technologies themselves. 3D printing is something that he has established in Togo. To take these technologies unto themselves, that's a way of saying that we don't want to be dispossessed from ownership, right? We don't simply want to be passive or simply digital users, but actually creators in this process, right? And these are the kinds of what I think are potent checks against what, not an inevitability, right? These risk factors for autonomy that I see as emerging through the digital world. It's a way of recategorizing and rethinking the question of technology and its relationship to work and life, using the lens of not using slavery as a kind of model, but then separating out the material violence into an idea of despotism informed by theory. I know that obviously the time is up, but I just to echo your last point, Dominique. A lot of people ask me why Aristotle. Aristotle, it's for me, I think there are two motivating factors. One is I definitely want to deny the idea that Aristotle is a Western is a scholar that is owned by the West, or an idea of Western thought. Extremely influential in Western thinking, extremely problematic. But that, for example, takes out all of the different ways in which Aristotle was taken into different or separate traditions of thought, such as Islamic. And I think there needs to be a consideration of what the ancient Mediterranean has meant for different traditions of thought that is not perhaps Western. Substantively, there's also this idea, I think Frantz Fanon, actually, when I read the Wretched of the Earth, when he talks about the native intellectual, he says on the first level, the native intellectual, and then that's already complicated because in South Africa, I'm not necessarily an indigenous native, I'm not part of the kind of people of colonized lands. The native intellectual first learns to learn the language of the Europeans, right, that speaks with letters. And this is something that you see in even the slave discourses, the narratives of Harriet Jacobs, etc. The idea of this educational program that takes you out of the wretched of the earth. So Aristotle for me becomes a step figure to think about, both as reclaiming it from Western discourse, but also appropriating it and appropriating these ideas that have traditionally been used and weaponized against peoples, and to turn around and say, actually, I understand what you're talking about, and no, I don't belong to this theory, or I'm going to use this theory in a different way. And I think a lot of interesting scholarship is looking into some of these ideas. How can we rethink Aristotle with gender? How can we rethink Aristotle with race? How can we rethink Aristotle in different, because he's been so influential in the very way in which the Western Academy has been formed, the very ideas that the split of the different branches of knowledge, that when you're looking at Aristotle, you're not just looking at him as a figure, a historical figure, you're actually looking at the whole kind of development of a certain way of thinking, and taking apart that is in this kind of deconstructive process, and appropriating, I think, is a part of making your claim against it.
Thank you so much, Ziyaad. And you know, I think like to look at Aristotle as a Mediterranean thinker that has a profound influence, and also his thought was also the legacy of those many thought is very, very important. Do you have like a few more minutes, because there's a question in the chat that I've been asked to read. Would you mind? Okay.
No, absolutely.
Okay. So let me take this question. Okay, so I'm reading. You have mentioned in your writings the current no-code solutions are making the field even by creating citizen coders. I think companies like Airtable are an example of the sort of solutions you may be thinking about. But don't you think that there still will be a digital divide? And in fact, these kinds of solutions will make things worse, because the masses have been given the illusions of being digitally competent, when in fact, they have become even more dependent on these tools, thinking they are part of it, but in fact even further apart. A digital opiate is being created right under our eyes.
I really love that question a lot.
And this is from, did I say it's from Cameron Malik? Sorry, I may have forgotten that. It was like a private message, yeah.
Yeah, Cameron, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, when I started thinking about low and no code solutions, it's really in the context of this transformation of humans into digital users, right? There's something in this idea that we are simply users, i.e. I'm sitting here on Zoom with all of you, and we're not proprietors of this platform. We don't own this tool. We don't own it. We're, renting space. We are simply users as a kind of experience of the digital world. And when I was thinking about low and no code, for me, it was a way of rethinking, okay, well, how can we level the playing fields, exactly as you say? But I think you're right, actually. I think that, depending on how that low and no code, those kind of products are rolled out and the ownership structures that are therefore involved, they can very much, if you ignore the political economy behind it, they can very much be a kind of opiate, a kind of a false illusion. And that's why I think this is, when you look at this framework of dispossessions, it has to go hand in hand with skills development themselves. There needs to be an ability to understand and to have a meaningful way to work with this environment, and not simply be a kind of passive user that now has been empowered through the, as you say, the illusion of low and no code. So my thinking on that is actually to broaden it and to say, well, low and no code is a good step forward, right? To move away from simple passive digital users to kind of being a little bit more participatory in the digital world. But it needs to be accompanied with a sustained effort for peoples to narrow that the digital divide, the gap in skills.
Thank you so much, Ziyaad. It's we are past our time. I want to thank you, immensely for being here. I really want, please don't forget to send us your paper. I don't know if it's been released yet, but I think we are going to read it with a great interest and really looking forward even to hear this conversation again. So thank you so much. And I'm very grateful to my colleague Ralph Borland that, of course, invited you and gave us a chance to hear you. So thank you, Ralph, if you're listening to us. And yeah, I don't know what's coming next, but Ralph will communicate. I'm just borrowing his seats here, so I'm not in charge. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. And please follow us on social media, and you will hear about all of the great talk that we have. And I'm very happy, Ziyaad, to hear that you were already with us a few weeks ago.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.